Hello and welcome to the session on Pragmatism, Origins and Concept. Philosophy as a discipline is characterized by many movements, concepts, schools and streams of thoughts. These concepts, theories and streams of thoughts contributed to the development and expansion of philosophy. In this unit, we will look at one philosophical thought or concept, namely pragmatism. Pragmatism can be called a philosophical movement, and this movement is characterized by claims such as an ideology or proposition is true if it works satisfactorily, and the meaning of a proposition is to be found in the practical consequences of accepting it, and practical ideas are to be rejected. It is important to understand the historical background, origins and the major philosophical positions associated with pragmatism to understand it in a better way. So, in this unit, we will look at the history and origins and the major philosophical positions of pragmatism. Pragmatism will be discussed in depth in the next unit once we have an idea of the background and philosophical basis of this movement. Pragmatism was developed and originated in the United States during the late 19th century. One notable feature of this movement is that, although it was a movement within philosophy, it has influenced a good number of non-philosophers from other fields and disciplines. People from the fields of law, education, politics, sociology, psychology and literary criticism were influenced by pragmatism, and the concept of pragmatism was used in the theories of all these fields. In this unit, we will look at pragmatism as a movement within philosophy, but in the course of this unit and the next few units, we will touch upon these other fields too. As we have already seen, pragmatism as a philosophical movement began in the 1870s. The philosophers who contributed to the origin and formation of this movement belonged to a philosophical school called the Metaphysical Club. The major figures of this movement are Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey and George Herbert Mead. These four philosophers developed what is now called the classical pragmatism. It was William James who used the term pragmatism for the first time in print. In 1898, he used that term in a speech entitled Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results delivered at the University of California. But in his speech, James admitted that the term had been originally coined almost 30 years ago by C.S. Peirce. James regarded Peirce's series in 1877 named Illustrations of the Logic of Science as the foundation of pragmatism. Another major figure in the classical pragmatism is John Dewey. His writings had a great impact on American intellectual life for all 50 years. After Dewey, pragmatism lost much of its momentum and influence. In the 20th century, this movement collapsed. But Peirce, James and Dewey had laid foundations for a rich philosophical tradition. There has been a recent interest in pragmatism. Several philosophers explored their concept and ideas developed by Peirce, James and Dewey. The major as well as the most controversial of these recent philosophers is Richard Rorty. The following contemporary philosophers have also revisited pragmatism in the recent years: Hilary Putnam, Nicholas Rusher, Jürgen Habermas, Susan Haack and W.V.O. Quine and Wilfrid Sellars also used a revised pragmatism to criticize logical positivism in the 1960s. Pragmatism, like any other philosophical tradition, was inspired by the ideas of earlier philosophies. The founding fathers of classical pragmatism have admitted that they drew inspiration from many of the earlier philosophers and their ideas. The major inspirations for the classical pragmatism were Francis Bacon, David Hume, Thomas Reid, Immanuel Kant, G.W.F. Hegel, J.S. Mill and George Berkeley. History and origins of classical pragmatism. In the 1870s, there was a group of dozen men who had their education from Howard University. They met for informal philosophical discussions in Cambridge. The group was called the Metaphysical Club. The Metaphysical Club members included Chauncey Wright, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who became Supreme Court Justice later, Charles Sanders Peirce, and William James, who became the first founding members of classical pragmatism, were also members of this group. Charles Sanders Peirce was a logician, mathematician, and scientist. William James was a psychologist and moralist, and he had a medical degree as well. Peirce and James published several essays which were believed to be the foundations of classical pragmatism. The most famous early works of these philosophers on pragmatism are as follows. The groundbreaking essays on pragmatism by Peirce are The Fixation of Belief in 1877, How to Make Our Ideas Clear in 1878. William James has the following works to his credit: Remarks on Spencer's Definition of Mind's Correspondence in 1878, The Principles of Psychology in 1890, The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy in 1896. Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking in 1907, The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902, and The Meaning of Truth, a sequel to Pragmatism in 1909. John Dewey also published works on pragmatism. His most famous works are Reconstruction in Philosophy in 1920, Experience and Nature in 1925, The Quest for Certainty in 1929. Dewey emerged as a major figure after Peirce and James. G. H. Mead was his colleague and collaborator. Pragmatism became an important feature of the discipline of philosophy during Dewey's time. But by the 1940s, after the publication of Dewey's Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, pragmatism had become less popular and lost its momentum. Defining pragmatism. Pragmatism can be called a method of philosophy. Pragmatism was defined in 1878 by Peirce as follows. Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then, our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. If we have to understand a conception in a fruitful way, we have to consider the practical effects of the objects on our conception. Then, our conception of those effects is the whole of our conception of the object. This was later called the pragmatic maxim. Pragmatism may be presented as a way of clarifying metaphysical and epistemological disputes. Peirce developed the idea that inquiry depends on real doubt, not mere verbal or hyperbolic doubt. Different versions of these were formulated by Peirce and James in their attempts to clarify the meaning of abstract concepts or ideas. The pragmatic maxim points to a broadly verificationist conception of linguistic meaning. According to this, facts which are unknowable in principle do not have any sense. Theories should not be judged by their origins or their relations to previous data or facts. They should be judged primarily by their fruits and consequences. The basic idea is presented metaphorically by James and Dewey. For them, scientific theories are instruments or tools for coping with reality. They put much focus on the ability of a theory to solve a problem. As Dewey emphasized, the usefulness of a theory lies in its power to solve problems. What is essential is that theories will help to solve pressing problems and to clear up significant difficulties in inquirers. If a theory functions practically in this way, it makes sense to use it. But we must always know that there is the possibility that a theory will be replaced by some theory that works even better than the first one. Similar view can be found in Karl Popper's falsificationist philosophy of science. Philosophical positions in pragmatism. Pragmatism is characterized by certain philosophical positions. It is important to understand these positions before we deal with the important tenets of pragmatism. The major philosophical positions in pragmatism are instrumentalism, radical empiricism, verificationism, conceptualism, a denial of the fact-value distinction, and fallibilism. We will discuss some of these in this module. Instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is a philosophical view in the philosophy of science. Instrumentalism is the view that a scientific theory is a useful instrument to understand the world. This view places importance on the ability of a theory or a concept to explain or predict the phenomena that happen in the world. That is to say, according to instrumentalism, a concept or a theory is to be evaluated by how effectively it explains and predicts phenomena. Instrumentalism does not take into account the realism or anti-realism debate. Instrumentalism doesn't focus on whether or not an observed phenomena actually exists. Instead, it put emphasis on the analysis of whether the results and evaluation fit with observed phenomena. Instrumentalism provides a framework for the practice of science and scientific method. Instrumentalism is not specifically anti-realist, but it maintains that the role of the scientist is constrained by empirical results. The theories that can be developed can offer explanations of how the world works. These explanations should be seen as best approximations of the world rather than an ultimate reality. Theories about unobservable phenomena are regarded as having no scientific meaning. Science may claim about unobservable objects, but these claims should not be regarded as meaningful. The usefulness of an instrumentalist position becomes particularly clear in sciences where core concepts are fundamentally elusive or disputed. Examples are quantum physics and astronomy. An instrumentalist position was put forward by Ernst Mach. Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions posits problem solving as a key component of scientific practice. He provides extensive examples of how our conceptions of reality have changed over time. Radical Empirism. Radical empirism is a doctrine in pragmatism, and it was outforced by William James, who was one of the renowned pragmatists. This doctrine tries to explain experience. It says that experience includes both particulars and relations between those particulars. Therefore, both the particulars and the relationships between them deserve a place in our explanations about experience. According to radical empirism, any philosophical worldview is flawed if it stops at the physical level and fails to explain how meaning, values, and intentionality can arise from that. James talks about radical empirism in his The Meaning of Truth. According to James, radical empirism is a postulate, a statement of fact, and a conclusion. The postulate is that a concept can be debated only if it is defined in terms drawn from experience. The fact is that our experience contains disconnected entities as well as various types of connections. Our experience is full of meaning and values. The conclusion is that our worldview possesses in its own right a continuous structure. Radical empirism relates to discussions about direct versus indirect realism. Early 20th century discussions against their idealism can also be seen in the light of radical empirism. The conclusion that our worldview does not need trans-empirical support is also important in discussions about meaning. Verificationism is the view that a statement or question is only legitimate either if there is some way to determine whether the statement is true or false, or what the answer to the question is. This view was very much associated with the theories of the logical positivists of the early 20th century. Logical positivists made use of this doctrine to differentiate between meaningful and meaningless propositions. The origin of verificationism can be dated back to the ideas of Hume and Empiricism. They believed that observation was the only way we can acquire knowledge. We can see that verificationism was used in the history of philosophy to prove that many philosophical debates are meaningless, false, unscientific, or in some other way illegitimate. Logical positivists use this method to negate many religious, metaphysical, aesthetic, and ethical sentences. But it is also important to note that some verificationists saw verificationism as a guide for doing good work in religion, metaphysics, and ethics. A good example for this is the classical pragmatism. Conceptualism was a doctrine, was very influential and has influenced the ideas of most of the early modern thinkers like René Descartes and John Locke. The fact-value distinction. There can be two types of arguments which can be claimed through reason alone, arguments that describe a collective opinion. The fact-value distinction is a concept used to distinguish between these two types of arguments. In other words, it is a distinction between what is can be discovered by science, philosophy or reason and what ought to be, that is a judgment which can be agreed upon by consensus. The terms positive and normative are used to represent these types. Positive statements make claims based on facts. Example, water molecules are made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Normative statements make a claim based on values or norms. Example, water ought to be protected from environmental pollution. The fact-value distinction emerged in philosophy during the Enlightenment period. David Hume argued that human beings are unable to ground normative arguments in positive arguments. That is to say, human beings are unable to derive ought from is. According to Friedrich Nietzsche, we are governed by a table of values. Nietzsche points out that what is common among different peoples is the act of creating values even if the values are different. He asserts that what made people great was not the content of their beliefs but the act of valuing. Thus, the values articulated by a community are not as important as the collective will to see those values come to pass. The willing is more essential than the worth of the goal itself. The idea that one value system is no more worthy than the next has become a common premise in modern social sciences. Max Weber and Martin Heidegger absorbed it and made it their own. It shaped their philosophical endeavor as well as their political understanding. Fallibilism. Fallibilism is the philosophical principle that beliefs, expectations and understanding of the world could be proved wrong. New evidences will disprove some previously held position or belief. Fallibilism believes that we should be open to such new beliefs. It also emphasizes on the importance that any claim justified today may need to be revised or withdrawn in the light of new evidence, new arguments and new experiences. This is the taken for granted position in the natural sciences. This principle refers to that act that our interpretations, valuations, our practices and traditions are subject to historical flux and change. Some fallibilists argue that absolute certainty about knowledge is impossible. As a formal doctrine, fallibilism is most strongly associated with Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey and other pragmatists. They used to attack foundationalism. But if we look at the history of ideas, we can see that it is already present in the views of some ancient philosophers including Xenophon, Socrates and Plato. Another proponent of fallibilism is Karl Popper, who was a major figure in the philosophy of science. Fallibilism has been employed by Willard van Orman Quine to attack the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. Unlike skepticism, fallibilism does not demand that we should abandon our knowledge. On the other hand, it argues that because empirical knowledge can be revised by further observation, what we consider as knowledge today might possibly turn out to be false. Some fallibilists make an exception for things that are axiomatically true. They give mathematical and logical knowledge as examples of such truths. Others say that even these axiomatic systems are in a sense infallible, we are still capable of error when working with these systems. The critical rationalist Hans Albert argues that it is impossible to prove any truth with certainty even in logic and mathematics. This argument is called Munchausen trilemma. Let me summarize the main ideas we have discussed so far. As we have already seen, pragmatism is the distinctive contribution of American thought to philosophy. It is a movement that attracted much attention in the later part of the 19th century, but this movement went into decline and re-emerged in the last part of the 20th century. Pragmatism is a method of philosophy begun by Charles Sanders Peirce, popularized by William James. Pragmatism is associated with two other major early representatives, John Dewey and George Herbert Mann. Pragmatism is characterized by certain philosophical positions that include instrumentalism, radical empiricism, verificationism, conceptualism, a denial of the fact-value distinction, and fallibilism. One of the important features of pragmatism is that it is a high regard for science. Now, you can try to answer the questions given here. What are the major claims of pragmatism? What is metaphysical claim? What is pragmatic maxim? How did William James define radical empiricism? What is fallibilism? Now, you may go through the books for further reference. The Writings of William James by James William in 1977, a comprehensive edition. Edited with an introduction by John J. McDermott, Chicago, University of Chicago Press. How to Make Our Ideas Clear in 1878 and the Essential Pairs, Selected Philosophical Writings, Volume 1 in 1876 to 1893, which is by Peirce Charles Sanders in 1992, edited by Nathan Hauser and Christine Clausel, Bloomington, Indiana University Press. A Phenomenology or Pragmatism in Pragmatism, Critical Concepts in Philosophy, Volume 2, by Benoist Jocelyn in 2005 and edited by Russell B. Goodman, Routledge, London and New York. Classical American Pragmatism, Humanities-Ebooks by Martin A. Bertman in 2007. Pragmatism, a Contemporary Reader by Russell B. Goodman, Routledge, 1995. Hope that you have enjoyed this session. We can meet again with another topic soon. Thank you for watching this program.